Hello and welcome back to my Pikmin review marathon, where we're finally wrapping this thing up by taking a look at what is technically the newest game in the series with Hey Pikmin for the 3DS. Now the reason that I say that this is technically the newest game is because there was Pikmin Bloom, which released recently on mobile devices, but I personally don't really count that as a proper full-on entry because it seems quite bare bones from my experience with it. So, for now, I'm counting this as the last one. Hey Pikmin is easily the least talked about game in the series, and I do wonder if that's because of A, it's just a mediocre game, or B, is it because it was released so late into the 3DS's life cycle that nobody was interested and we've actually got a hidden gem on our hands? Well, let's do what we do best here and dive into it. Something that I should point out for the sake of transparency is that in order to record the footage for this video, I actually had to emulate the game. Because of this, if you do happen to notice any frame drops, any slowdown, or quality changes throughout the review, it isn't necessarily the game's fault, it could just be the emulation and me messing about with settings. I would love for the next Nintendo console to be backwards compatible with 3DS cartridges, that way I wouldn't have to resort to doing this, but still, at least I can do this as a final option. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at how the game begins. As per usual, Olimar is flying through space in his ship after a long hard day working for Hocketate Freight. The ship that he's piloting this time though is brand new and is named the SS Dolphin 2, being an upgraded version of his original ship used in the very first Pikmin game. In order to get home, he activates warp speed but ends up colliding with an asteroid field, which causes him to crash down to a mysterious nearby planet. Interestingly, this is stated to not be the same planet that we've explored in the previous games, which is odd considering that we still see signs of human-made objects, which either means that Olimar is wrong about this not being the same planet, or potentially that the humans in the Pikmin universe populated other planets besides Earth, maybe because Earth became inhospitable due to radiation. This is actually really cool because that could theoretically mean that somewhere out there the humans still exist, and we could even find them in a future game. Anyway, getting back to the topic at hand now, Olimar has crashed his ship, but luckily he isn't on his own because it just so happens that the Pikmin species can be found on this planet too. As well as that, the Dolphin 2 has an onboard AI which keeps Olimar company and acts as the guide for the rest of the game. Upon crashing the ship, it lost all of its fuel, which is referred to as sparklium, and it's up to Olimar and the Pikmin to go out into the world and find objects which can be converted into enough fuel to get them back home. As far as the story goes, that's pretty much it for the rest of the game, and while the story is somewhat minimal, I do like the small amount of intrigue presented by the fact that we're not on the same planet as in the previous games, and this is a brand new place to explore. Other than that though, this is a very by-the-numbers Pikmin experience, crashing onto a planet and having to collect a resource to either survive or make it back home. It's all stuff that we've seen in the previous 3 games. What we haven't seen in the previous games though is this brand new gameplay style. Because yeah, while the plot of Hey Pikmin is extremely similar to what we've seen before, the actual game couldn't be any different. You see, not only is Hey Pikmin a 2D puzzle platformer, but it's also a much more linear level by level experience too. This means that a ton of the elements that would usually make up a Pikmin game are either completely absent or have been heavily modified. For example, there's no overarching time limit to be worried about, there's no day-by-day system, there's no open-ended exploration, there's no character switching or multitasking to be done. The whole thing is much more straightforward than usual. One thing that does return though, of course, is the Pikmin themselves, and in Hey Pikmin we have all of the types found in the story mode of Pikmin 3 returning. So we've got red Pikmin who are the strongest in combat and are resistant to fire, we've got yellow Pikmin who can be thrown further than the others and are resistant to electricity, and we've got the rock Pikmin who can be thrown at breakable objects to smash through them. Of course, the blue Pikmin also return, but these are actually a little bit different to in the previous games. While they are still resistant to water, the water sections in Hey Pikmin are actually more interesting here than in the last games, and the reason for that is that Olimar can actually swim around, rather than just walking along the bottom of the watery areas like in the previous games. These sections add a lot of verticality into the game, and I actually really enjoyed them. Being limited to only using the blue Pikmin also made things interesting because there's some examples where you need to change the level of the water in order to bring the other types of Pikmin with you. I would actually like to see this become a feature in the next Pikmin game, but instead of being 2D, have Olimar and the Pikmin swimming around in full 3D, going into flooded caves and stuff to explore and find treasures. Then we also have the winged Pikmin, who also work slightly differently in this game. Not only being able to fly around, making them excel at aerial combat, but also being able to grab Olimar when he falls, and this allows him to basically glide around. This is used in some of the best levels in the entire game, where you're falling down caverns and having to avoid spiky vines, or you're getting pushed around by gusts of wind and you're needing to stay out of the way of obstacles while also throwing Pikmin to attack enemies at the same time. There's not too many points in the game where it feels too action heavy, so when moments like this do happen, they really stand out as a highlight. Again, this is something that I would like to see return in a future mainline Pikmin game, but in full 3D. These changes made to the blue and winged Pikmin make them far more unique than they were previously, and it was nice to see that they had some new ideas for them. It is slightly disappointing that there's no brand new types of Pikmin though. With us being on a totally brand new planet, they could have come up with some really interesting ideas for Pikmin types that we've never seen anything like before. On top of that, the purple and white Pikmin don't make an appearance in this game at all, which as you know is extra disappointing for me personally because I love the little purple guys, but never mind I guess. With this being a 3DS title, you just know that there's going to be some gimmicky stuff here. Sometimes the gimmicks in 3DS games are actually quite good, like the gyro aiming in Ocarina of Time 3D, which has since become a staple of the series. But here in Hey Pikmin, I would probably argue that the gimmick is quite a bad one. You see, in order to control this game, you have to hold the 3DS with one hand to use the analog stick in order to move Olimar around. That part is straightforward. But the part that is a little bit annoying is that in order to throw Pikmin, swap Pikmin types, activate any other abilities, and even interact with menus, you have to use the touchscreen. So this causes a situation where you'll be supporting the weight of the 3DS with one hand, while you poke at the screen with the other hand, and it's just a little bit uncomfortable after a while. Plus, can you picture doing this in public? You would probably look like a bit of a lunatic. The added negative with this system is that the 3DS's touchscreen is obviously at the bottom, which is significantly smaller and lower quality than the top screen. But that means that the entire game looks worse than it would have if they had just ditched all of the touch elements. Don't get me wrong, I get why they opted for this control scheme. It does sort of make sense, and it's not like it's that annoying or anything, but at the same time I feel like a control scheme like the one seen in the Yoshi's Island games might have made more sense, and would have made the game more comfortable to play. Overall though, I don't want to make too much of a big deal about this, because it really doesn't get in the way too much, especially once you're used to it. And, to be honest, there's so many little details with this game that I absolutely love, that it more than makes up for it. So let's talk about that. First of all, this is the only Pikmin game that features a friggin' jetpack. That's right. With this being a 2D platformer, it kinda requires that Olimar be able to have some sort of jump ability, which he's able to do via his new jetpack. This only lasts for an extremely short amount of time though, but it is cool being able to make it over gaps and up onto small ledges by doing this. Also, it does create some interesting situations where you have to separate yourself from the Pikmin while you explore an area that they can't reach, which reminds you of just how vulnerable you are without your Pikmin friends. It's actually used to pretty great effect, and I know I'm repeating myself, but this jetpack is something that I would like to see get expanded and used in a mainline game too. It turns out that Hey Pikmin does actually have some pretty interesting ideas. Plus, something else that I liked about this is that when you reach a certain amount of Sparklium, Olimar will receive a certain type of upgrade. A lot of the time these upgrades just give you more health, which is a little bit boring because you don't really need that. The game is quite easy after all. But you do also get upgrades to the jetpack too, which make it last a lot longer than it did at the start of the game, which was pretty rewarding. My favourite thing about this whole game though is that a lot of the time when you discover a new group of Pikmin, a short cutscene will play which shows them interacting with the world around them and with each other, and some of these are actually pretty funny and they're always adorable to watch. They add so much personality to the Pikmin, and I would say that out of any other Pikmin game so far, this is the one where the Pikmin feel the most alive. I would absolutely love to see this become a thing in the main games. I want to see the Pikmin playing and living their lives without Olimar, and so far this is the only game where we get a proper glimpse of what that's like. Like I say, I just loved this element of the game. Another thing that I liked was the brand new Pikmin Park mode. The way that this works is that every time you finish a level, all of the Pikmin you currently have with you will enter the Onion. This is very similar to the mainline Pikmin games, where at the end of each day, the Pikmin would all return to the Onion and be safe for the next day. However, the difference here is that upon starting a new level in Hey Pikmin, you can't go up to the Onion and get out the Pikmin from the previous level, and you instead have to rely solely on the Pikmin that you find within that particular level. So what happens to the Pikmin from the previous levels then? Well, they go to Pikmin Park. Pikmin Park is the area around where your ship crashed, and all of the Pikmin you've found will be transported here after each level. In between levels you can visit the park and instruct the Pikmin to explore the surrounding areas, where they'll be able to use the different abilities to find items to convert into fuel for you. It takes them a few levels to actually find anything, but the more Pikmin that you have, the quicker you find things, so you're incentivized to keep as many Pikmin alive as possible in the actual levels. While this is a really good concept and it actually gives the Pikmin a use that aren't actively being used in the levels, I do feel like this could have been massively expanded. There's only 5 or so little areas for the Pikmin to explore, and they never really find anything of any real value. What I think was a massive missed opportunity here is that I think the Pikmin should have found items that gave you different mini-games to play. With this being a 3DS game, they could have come up with some awesome ideas for Pikmin-related games to play. I mean, do you remember all of the mini-games from Super Mario 64 DS? Something like that would have been incredible. And I know that I always come back to this, but another thing that the Pikmin could have found in Pikmin Park are cosmetics for Olimar and the different Pikmin types to wear. That's one thing that I'll say about Pikmin Bloom, it's the first Pikmin game to embrace cosmetic unlockables. I mean, just look at this Pikmin riding in a toy aeroplane for God's sake. It's adorable, and this needs to be in the next mainline Pikmin game, or I'm gonna kick off. Still, Pikmin Park is a really good concept, even if the execution in this particular game isn't the greatest. If it was expanded and offered better rewards though, this could be an awesome addition to the mainline series, and it's yet another thing that Hey Pikmin brings to the table that I love. But now, and I know you all saw this coming, let's talk about all of the things with this game that I didn't like. Firstly, one thing that I can't stand about certain Nintendo games is when content is completely locked behind amiibo figures. These things are expensive, and they very often become rare and almost completely unobtainable for the vast majority of people. So to have in-game content, no matter how small or insignificant, locked behind them, is super annoying. I hate how in Breath of the Wild there's certain costumes that can only be found if you have the different Zelda amiibo. I hate how in Mario Kart 8 you can only get the Mii outfits by scanning amiibo. And I hate it how there's an entire set of collectibles that literally can't be found in Hey Pikmin unless you scan in the amiibo figures first. This isn't the worst example of amiibo support, but I do feel like maybe when you 100% the game, the amiibo collectibles should become accessible even without the figures. This would be a good reward for putting the time in and finishing the whole game. I feel the same way about my previous examples too. Like with Mario Kart 8, when you get an absurd amount of coins, maybe you should have unlocked the costumes even without the figures. Even if it was something silly like you start unlocking them at 20,000 coins or something, it would be better than nothing. Or in Breath of the Wild, maybe when you get to something like 300 Korok seeds, you start unlocking the amiibo outfits. I don't know, I've just never really liked content being completely inaccessible like that, but maybe I'm making a bigger deal out of it than I need to. Anyway, aside from that massive tangent that I just went on, the single worst thing about this game is that despite all of the positive points that I've mentioned throughout this review, the actual core gameplay experience here is just a little bit uninteresting. It's a perfectly serviceable 2D puzzle platformer, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't really do anything that other games like this haven't already done a million times before. The removal of a lot of the core elements of what makes a Pikmin game stand out really doesn't help either, and I feel like they could have made a 2D Pikmin game that felt more like a traditional Pikmin experience. The obvious route they could have taken is made Hey Pikmin a Metroidvania game, where you have one large interconnected map with loads of different themed areas which you slowly uncover by getting new abilities and finding new Pikmin types. I think this could have worked amazingly, and they might have even been able to work in the day-by-day structure into this as well. Having you go to safe areas when nighttime arrives, and while you're safe with your Pikmin party, you could check in at Pikmin Park to manage the Pikmin there too. Unfortunately though, because they chose a much safer linear level by level structure, it ends up making almost every level really forgettable outside of a select few standout ones. 95% of the levels here though I wouldn't even be able to recall because of how much they blend into each other. It's actually a little bit irritating because I love all of the little details here, like the Pikmin Park, the cutscenes, the new features like the jetpack, the flying and the swimming, and I really love how the collectibles are back to being unique human-made objects rather than the slightly repetitive fruit from Pikmin 3. But because of the level design and the structure of the game being so generic, I would struggle to recommend that you play this unless you're a huge fan of the series. It doesn't help that there's literally nothing to do outside of the main game either. Sure, you have the Pikmin Park, but like I say, that's not really expansive enough to count as a proper side mode. What I mean is that there's no mission or challenge mode, no multiplayer modes, no minigames, nothing. Which is a little bit disappointing considering how much side content is normally featured in the Pikmin games. It's almost like I want to go into more detail about what the game is doing to make it so forgettable, but it's actually quite difficult to pinpoint. There's very little making the game stand out in any way, which ends up making it difficult to actually say what's wrong with it outside of simply saying that it's boring. It's similar in a way to how I feel about the new Super Mario Bros. Games. They're perfectly fine and it's not like they do anything specifically wrong, but they just don't do anything distinct enough to make them stand out in any meaningful way. They lack a sense of soul, and Hey Pikmin suffers from the exact same problem. Not only that, but the story presented here is really simple as well, which is a huge downgrade when you come in from Pikmin 3, which by far had the most story development out of any of the previous games. But still, let's now talk about how the game ends and where the series currently stands. Go to the time on the screen now if you want to avoid any spoilers, because we're going to be talking about the last sections of the game, including the final cutscene and the final boss. Let's go. In order to reach the true ending of the game, you're gonna have two tasks, the first of which is to get 30,000 Sparklium to power the ship up to reach Hocate, but once you've finally done that, you'll be informed that there's actually a second objective. You need to find a piece of the ship that broke off when it crashed, which is vital to making it back home safely. So when you've got the 30,000 Sparklium that you need, and you've finished every level in the game, you'll finally unlock the secret final boss fight. Speaking of boss fights, some of these are actually really good. A favourite of mine was the fiery blowhog, which is a massive version of the ones seen in previous games. To defeat this you need to throw a Pikmin at a bomb rock, which by the way yet again can be picked up by any colour of Pikmin and not just the yellow ones. I'm never gonna let that go. Then you use that bomb rock to stun the blowhog by throwing it into its snout as it's sucking in air, and then you need to go through a door which brings you out on the other side of the arena. At this point you can throw Pikmin at its back as it slips off of the platform it's standing on. It's fairly straightforward, but dodging all of the projectiles while trying to do all of that multitasking felt really good. And some of the other bosses here are great too, but the one I really want to talk about is the final boss. This thing is probably the most epic final boss seen in any Pikmin game, being this massive mutated plant with 3 heads that attempts to eat you. After beating its first 2 heads, it starts to transform and activates a second phase where it grows legs and attempts to stomp on you. Then after that, a third phase happens where it begins flying around the arena and shooting at you. It's actually pretty climactic, and working out how to beat all of the different forms felt really satisfying. It's probably a bit weird to say, but I actually think that this is one of the best bosses in the entire series, which I really didn't expect coming from a 3DS spin-off. After the battle concludes, you get the missing ship piece and the game ends with Olimar once again returning home and leaving the Pikmin behind on the mysterious planet. It's kind of weird how nothing more happens, it just feels a little bit anticlimactic because it's like the whole game doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. We basically end the game at the same exact point that Pikmin 3 ended, so it just seems a bit unnecessary as a game. But I guess that makes sense with this just being a handheld spin-off, but still, I would have liked for some kind of twist to happen, even if it was a minor one. But there we go, that sums up my experience with Hey Pikmin, and my final thoughts? It's alright. It's a shame that the core gameplay is so uninspired because there's actually a lot of little things that I love about it. But when the main game is a bit bland, I can't really recommend this unless you're a huge Pikmin fan or a huge fan of puzzle platformers in general. For anyone else, you might want to give this one a miss. To absolutely nobody's surprise at all, I'm putting Hey Pikmin in 4th place in my series ranking. It's clearly nowhere near as good as any other Pikmin game, but to judge it against them almost feels a bit unfair. Not only is this a 3DS game, but it's also a spin-off, and it's not even the same genre as the other games. But even considering that, I do feel like they could have done a better job with this concept, and more effort definitely could have gone into the side content too. The graphics are okay, some of the characters probably could have looked a bit better, but the backgrounds actually look really nice and there's quite a bit of visual variety with all of the areas you visit. The sound design is again quite average, having some nice music but nothing that will stay with you for very long. The controls, like I've said, are a little bit weird and potentially could have been reworked to use a standard control scheme rather than the touchscreen analog stick hybrid that they went for. And the gameplay itself is an odd mix of interesting ideas with slightly mediocre level designs. The next Pikmin game could take quite a few things from this and implement them into a mainline game in a much better way than what was done here. But still, we'll always know that the seeds of these ideas originally sprouted from Hey Pikmin. And that, my friends, are my thoughts on Hey Pikmin, and with that we've wrapped up the Pikmin review marathon, and I'm all caught up with the series, and I'm ready to join you all in waiting for the eventual release of Pikmin 4. It's gotta come out soon, right? Until then though, surely at this point I've got enough experience with Pikmin combat that I can finally take on my old adversary. Let's do this. There you are. Right. Okay. Let's do this, Pikmin. Attack! Oh. Well, it turns out that cats are completely immune to the power of the Pikmin. Who knew? Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!